In the fall term, I was teaching a course in Introduction to Philosophy at my home university, which is the University of Alabama at Birmingham, to a class of freshmen and sophomores. I had the students read in the course of the semester Socrates, Descartes, Nietzsche, John Stuart Mill. At the end of the course, a young woman came up to me, a student in the class. She had been very interested, she said, in the course, liked this philosophy a lot and wanted to learn more about it. She said, but I have one question. I'm very curious. She says, are there any philosophers living today? Well, one doesn't get a straight line like that very often, but I was unable to come up with a good reply, and I just meekly replied, well, yes, there are. And she seemed very excited by this news and said, oh, where are they? My ultimate objective this afternoon is to talk about the different kinds of harms that animals can suffer and the significance of them. When we talk about the treatment of animals, we tend to think mainly about causing pain. But of course, there are lots of other ways that harm might be done than just by causing pain, and I want to talk about those. Now, it's going to take me a while to get to this point in my talk, though, because first I want to have a fair amount to say about Charles Darwin. It's wonderful how coincidences sometimes occur. Yesterday, on the airplane flying from Atlanta to Washington, I was reading this book, which I had brought along. It's called The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. I don't know if you know. It's quite a wonderful book. It's about the Battle of Gettysburg. It came out during the 70s, so it's kind of an old book now. I think it got the Pulitzer Prize then. Anyway, I was reading along while half thinking about what I was going to say about Darwin today, when all of a sudden I came upon this passage. It is evening on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, and General Longstreet is in his tent talking with a Frenchman named Fremantle, who is coming along with his army, and they have the following exchange. Might have been, Longstreet chuckled. I know one that I heard of myself. While ago we sat around a fire, talked on Darwin, evolution. You read about it? Charles Darwin, theory of evolution. Can't say that I have. There are so many of these things rattling about, says Fremantle. Theory claims that men are descended from apes. Oh, that. Oh, yes. Well, I've heard distastefully of that. Well, we were talking on that. Finally agreed that Darwin was probably right. Then one fella said, with great dignity, he said, well, maybe you are come from an ape, and maybe I am come from an ape, but General Lee, he didn't come from no ape. So I do want to accept from anything that I say this afternoon the great Robert E. Lee. A few years ago, I set out to canvass the literature on Charles Darwin. I thought this would be a manageable task, but I soon realized what a naive idea this was. I don't know how many books have been written about Darwin, but there seem to be thousands, and each year more appear. Why so many? Well, of course, you may think the answer is obvious. Darwin was a surpassingly important figure in the history of human thought. But as I read these books, and more importantly, as I began to read the works of Darwin himself, it gradually dawned on me that all the attention is also due to Darwin's personal qualities. He was an immensely likable man. This comes across in his writings, modest and humane, with a personality that continues to draw people to him even today. Reflecting on his father's character, Francis Darwin once said that The two subjects which moved my father perhaps more strongly than any others were cruelty to animals and slavery. His detestation of both was intense, and his indignation was overpowering in case of any levity or want of feeling on these matters. Darwin's strong feelings about slavery run through several of his works, most notably the Journal of Researches that recorded his adventures on the Beagle Voyage. Today that book is available in paperback under the title The Voyage of the Beagle. It's a wonderful book. In it you'll find Darwin reflecting on the evils of slavery on many pages. His comments there are among the most moving in abolitionist literature. But it was Darwin's feelings about cruelty to animals that impressed his contemporaries most vividly. There are numerous anecdotes that show him remonstrating cab drivers who whipped their horses too smartly, solicitously caring for his own animals, and forbidding the discussion of vivisection in his home because, as he said, it makes me sick with horror even to think about it. At the height of his fame, Darwin wrote an article for a popular magazine condemning the infamous leg-hold trap in terms that wouldn't seem out of place in an animal rights periodical today. You won't learn this, though, by reading The Origin of Species. Darwin, for the most part, avoided moralizing in his scientific books. There was a reason for this. Earlier students of nature had viewed the natural order as a kind of moral laboratory in which God's design was everywhere evident. And so they found all manner of moral lessons in nature. Darwin believed it's a mistake to think about nature in this way. Nature is indeed red in tooth and claw. Rather than embodying some great moral design, nature operates by eliminating the unfit in ways that are often cruel and that do not conform to any human sense of right. So Darwin didn't want to moralize in his scientific works. Nevertheless, he did think that something can be learned about morality from the scientific study of origins. In the third chapter of his great book, The Descent of Man, he gives us an extended essay on morality. If you want to see Darwin the moral philosopher in operation, go to the third chapter of The Descent of Man. Here he says, "We shall take up morality approached from the side of natural history." And following this, he discusses, among other things, the nature of morality, its biological basis, the extent of our moral duties, prospects for moral progress, talks about the nature of conscience, talks about the difference between good people and bad people. It's really rather remarkable. And it's the work of a moral visionary as well as a man of science. Darwin's remarks about moral progress are especially striking. Darwin thought that humans are moral beings because nature has provided us with what he called the social instincts. The social instincts cause us to care about others. And they are, of course, Darwin thought, produced by natural selection, just as are all of our characteristics. At first, the social instincts do not reach very far. We care only about our near kin and those whom we may expect to help us in return. But then as time goes by, Darwin thought moral progress occurs as the social instincts are developed and spread ever more widely, and we come to care about the welfare of more and more of our fellow beings. The highest level of morality is reached, Darwin says, when the rights of all creatures, regardless of race, intelligence, or even species, are respected equally. I'll give you one paragraph from Darwin. "The social instincts, which no doubt were acquired by man, as by the lower animals, for the good of the community, will from the first have given him some wish to aid his fellows and some feeling of sympathy. Such impulses will have served him at a very early period as a rude rule of right and wrong. But as man gradually advanced in intellectual power and was enabled to trace the more remote consequences of his actions, as he acquired sufficient knowledge to reject baneful customs and superstitions, as he regarded more and more not only the welfare but the happiness of his fellow men, as from habit, following on beneficial experience, instruction, and example, his sympathies became more tender and widely diffused, so as to extend to men of all races, to the imbecile, the maimed, and other useless members of society, and finally to the lower animals. So would his standard of morality rise higher and higher. Now, what are we to make of all this? Well, one possibility is to say that Darwin's moral attitudes were separate from and independent of his strictly scientific achievement. In opposing slavery, Darwin was properly sympathetic to one of the great moral movements of his age. In objecting to cruelty to animals, he showed himself to be a kind-hearted person, as we all should be. But no more should be made of it than that. Now, on this way of thinking, the moral views that Darwin expresses in The Descent of Man are just so much extra baggage, having no more to do with the theory of natural selection than, say, Einstein's reflections on war and peace had to do with the theory of special relativity. Perhaps, like other 19th century writers, he couldn't resist the temptation of expressing his moral views alongside his scientific work at some point, but we should really keep them separate. That's one way you might think of this material in Darwin. There is, however, another way of looking at Darwin's life and work. Perhaps his scientific work and his moral views were connected, as he apparently believed they were, in some significant way. If so, then we may have reason to view them as of one piece, and it may not be so easy to embrace the one without the other. I believe that Darwinians have a special reason to be interested in the question of animal welfare, that Darwin's own concern about the rights of animals was really following systematically in a way that's very revealing from the rest of his work. So I want to talk a little bit about what Darwin says about non-human animals. Darwin devotes a great deal of attention to the question of whether non-human animals are capable of rationality. He devotes some attention to the question of whether non-human animals have anything like what we call morality. Let's take these up one at a time. Are animals rational? This was a topic of great concern to Darwin because he knew that from ancient times, man has been called the rational animal. It is one of the cornerstones of traditional thought that human beings are separated from the rest of creation in virtue of their superior rationality. So Darwin was very interested in the question of to what extent other animals also possess rationality. Are they capable of reason? He thinks that they obviously are, and he gives many examples of this. Examples involving monkeys, involving baboons, involving dogs. My favorite example, though, is an extended discussion Darwin actually has of the rationality of worms. While I was researching Darwin for a project I was working on, I tried to read all of his major books. And I came upon this one book he had written called The Formation of the Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. This was the last of Darwin's major books, published in, I think, 1872. The announced purpose of this book was to prove that the top layer of the soil, what was called the vegetable mold at that time, is actually produced by the action of worms. Worms take the soil in, extract nutrients from them, and then excrete what's left, and what's left is the upper layer of the soil, which is very rich and very important. So worms are very important for this reason. This was quite a significant discovery. This is one of the several significant discoveries that Darwin made other than natural selection. And so most of this book is devoted to that subject. However, I'm reading along, and I'm not, it's kind of interesting, but it's not too interesting. And I come to this paragraph in which Darwin says, as I was led in the course of pursuing this matter to keep several pots in my study filled with worms for several months, it occurred to me that I might take this occasion to conduct some small investigations upon the mental powers of worms, which had never been adequately studied. What? And then there follows 35 pages in which Darwin discusses the mental powers of worms. Thought, this is wonderful. Why isn't this famous? I guess the reason it's not famous is that people don't read those old books like that. I guess if you're going to read Darwin, people read The Origin of Species and maybe a little bit of the Descent of Man and let it go at that. But here we find Darwin discussing whether worms can reason. Sounds like a joke, the mental powers of worms, but Darwin was perfectly serious about it. He had noticed that worms drag leaves to the mouths of their burrows, both to use as food and to plug them up. And by his observations, he thought that worms do this in a businesslike and intelligent way. And Darwin wondered, do they do this as a result of reason or from unlearned instinct? Or perhaps by some other mechanism. So he conducted some experiments to try to find out. He, first of all, brought in some leaves from other districts of types that the worms would never have seen before, gave them to the worms to use to see if they could manage with differently shaped leaves. Then he took bits of paper and cut them out in different shapes to see whether the worms could cope with that. And he, to his own satisfaction at any rate, eliminated the other hypotheses. He thought that their behavior was so intelligent and purposeful that it couldn't be just instinct. So he finally concluded that worms show at least a modicum of intelligence. And he said, I realize that this will probably strike many people as quite absurd, but nonetheless, my observations have brought me to this conclusion. Well, it certainly does seem kind of absurd. You certainly don't think of worms as reasoning. As I said, this was in Darwin's last book, and he was already quite elderly when he wrote this. So you might think, well, this is just the kind, he'd become an elderly eccentric. I don't think so, though. I think that when you think about it, this is quite a canny choice of example because it illustrates a number of pervasive Darwinian themes very clearly. First of all, Darwin believed that intelligence comes in degrees. It isn't an all or nothing matter. The world does not divide into those beings who are rational and intelligent, sort of 100%, and on the other side of the divide, beings that simply have no intelligence at all. That may have been the way the world looked to some earlier thinkers who were in the grip of this view of man as having been made in the image of God as the rational being and other creatures simply as mindless brutes. But Darwin didn't accept that sort of picture, and he thought observation shows that intelligence is something, it's a matter of degree. There are more and less rational creatures. What better way to emphasize this than to hold open the possibility that there could be a modicum of intelligence even in the lowly earthworm? Secondly, Darwin regarded the presence of intelligence as an empirical matter. You want to see whether an animal is capable of rationality, you have to carefully observe the animal's behavior and habits. Darwin was quite aware that all of us have beliefs about what non-human animals are like, but that these beliefs are fostered much more by traditional religion and morality than by empirical observation. Now, Darwin was devoted to empirical observation. You might think, well, if he will attribute intelligence to a worm, that just shows he was willing to attribute intelligence to anything that moves. Not so. Darwin contrasted the behavior of the earthworm with other simple animals, such as the Sphex wasp. Darwin noted that the wasp also engages in a type of behavior similar to that of the worm, in that the wasp preys on grasshoppers. It paralyzes grasshoppers by injecting a poison into them. And then the wasp will grasp the grasshopper by an antenna and drag it to its lair. But, Darwin noted, if you clip off the antenna of the grasshoppers, then the wasp will go through the routine up to the point that it's supposed to drag it back to the lair, but there being no antenna there to use, the wasp will be utterly unable to cope with this situation. For instance, it will not occur to the wasp to grasp the leg of the grasshopper, which will do just as well, and drag it by the leg. So Darwin concluded that the worm was intelligent, at least in a way that the wasp was not. Thirdly, this example illustrates a pervasive theme of Darwin, which is a protest against human chauvinism. Darwin believes that animals of various sorts engage in behaviors which, if they occurred in humans, we would certainly take as signs of intelligence, as signs of rationality. He thought, when we observe the same behavior in a non-human animal, it's nothing but bias, it's nothing but prejudice, if we don't take it as similar evidence in their case. Once again, I think, what better way to illustrate this than by considering the decidedly odd example of the worm. Are animals moral? Darwin thinks it quite obvious that they are. Two reasons for this. The first has to do with impartial observation, or what Darwin would have regarded as impartial observation. The second has to do with the conception of morality itself. Asking a question like whether animals are rational, whether animals are moral, of course, can get complicated if we raise the question of what we mean by rational or moral. Darwin believed that moral feelings in human beings are simply refinements of social instincts which occur in many species. Nature has endowed us with the capacity to care for one another, to be upset and unhappy at one another's misfortune. That's the basis of morality, Darwin thought. That's what we call the social instincts. Well, if we examine the behavior of other animals, do we find the social instincts also operating in them? Darwin thinks it's obvious that we do. He tells a story of a pack of baboons in Abyssinia. I'm not really a very good scholar. I have no idea where Abyssinia is. Where is Abyssinia? You know? Ethiopia? All right. Abyssinia. All right, now I know. He says there was one naturalist who Darwin trusts reports seeing a great herd of baboons passing through a valley in Abyssinia when they were set upon by a pack of dogs. The dogs attacked. The baboons ran to a height where the dogs couldn't reach, assumed a kind of defensive position up on the heights, and were able to hold the dogs off. However, there was one young baboon, sort of an infant, who had been trapped in the valley, who didn't make it to the heights. This young baboon had managed to climb up onto a rock and it was surrounded by these yelping, barking dogs who were trying to get at it. One of the older baboons, Darwin refers to him as a true hero, descended from the heights, walked slowly and purposefully through the pack of dogs to where the youngster was isolated. The dogs, according to the report, were so astonished at this that they just stopped. The old baboon got the youngster and led it back up to the heights, at which point the dogs commenced to attacking again. Darwin regarded this as a true hero. This baboon is a true hero, he said. Well, why does Darwin interpret this as moral behavior? One way to regard this report would be just to smile and say, well, Darwin lived in the era of extreme anthropomorphism. These 19th century ladies and gentlemen out in the wild looking at the animals and interpreting everything in human terms, and Darwin was just guilty of this right along with the rest of them. I don't think so, though. I think, once again, Darwin had a point here. We would take the same sort of behavior as evidence of courage in a human, wouldn't we? If someone exposes himself or herself to an evident danger in order to rescue another who is in peril, it's certainly something that we regard as brave in a human. Why then shouldn't we take such behavior as evidence of a similar characteristic in other animals? Also, as I said, Darwin thought that the moral feelings of humans are simply refinements of the social instincts that are found throughout nature. So he saw the feelings which lead the baboons to behave in such ways as similar to, derived from a similar source of moral feelings in humans. So, animals can reason. Animals can have moral capacities. Darwin thought that in addition, they can feel frustrated, bored, curious, angry. He thought that they're capable of loving one another, the kind of love that's evident in the behavior of mothers toward their offspring frequently. That they experience tender feelings, that they can be cowardly or brave, and much more of this kind. Now, why was all this important to Darwin? Why did he bother to go on at great length, and believe me, he goes on at great length about each one of these matters? Well, first, of course, Darwin had a research program to promote. He believed that natural selection operates throughout nature in determining the types of beings that exist. He realized that this would be resisted, at least as far as humans are concerned. And he was right. Many people, even though they accepted after publication of The Origin of Species that other animals and plants may have evolved according to Darwinian principles, they still resisted the idea that human beings had evolved according to those principles. Darwin, in The Descent of Man, offered a great deal of physical evidence for mankind's evolutionary history. He pointed out that there is as much evidence in our bodies that we are the products of an evolutionary history as there is evidence that any animal is a product of an evolutionary history. However, he knew that it would not be enough to offer just evidence that our bodies have evolved, because from ancient times humans have been regarded as special because of our spiritual and intellectual capacities. So, Darwin thought it very important to show that human intellectual qualities could have evolved as well as human physical qualities. He tried to do this by showing a similarity between the mental capacities of humans and the mental capacities of other animals. His theory said that humans should resemble other animals closely if we are products of the same evolutionary history. So it was important for him to show that they do. Darwin had this kind of internal motivation in terms of his theory to try to see as many similarities as possible between humans and the other animals. The history of psychological and ethological studies since Darwin's time has confirmed this picture. But all of this has moral implications. If we are, in fact, much more similar to the other animals than people before Darwin had realized, doesn't it follow that our moral standing may be more closely related to that of the other animals than people before Darwin had realized? This point, as far as I know, was first made by a botanist who taught at Harvard in the latter part of the 19th century. Asa Gray, or actually in the middle of the 19th century, Asa Gray was a Harvard botanist who was Darwin's strongest supporter in America. If you think of T.H. Huxley as being Darwin's bulldog in England, Asa Gray did similar service in the United States. It's a fascinating man. Asa Gray was once invited to address the theological faculty at Yale in order to explain to them the implications of Darwinism and the new biology, of which Gray was a part. Gray gave a series of 3 lectures at Yale. The first 2 lectures were strictly scientific. It wasn't until toward the end of the third one that Gray turned to the points that concern us today. Concluding his third lecture, Asa Gray told the audience that he knew that people would resist Darwinism and that people would resist the idea that we are descended from ape-like ancestors. But he wondered about the motivation for this resistance. Why is this so difficult for people to accept, he asked. He believed that people resist this because they perceive, no matter how dimly, that there are ethical consequences that they might not welcome. Gray concluded by saying, "We are sharers not only of animal life, but of vegetable life as well, sharers with the higher brute animals in common instincts and feelings and affections. It seems to me that there is a sort of meanness in the wish to ignore the tie. I fancy that human beings may become more humane when they realize that, as their dependent associates live a life in which man has a share, so they have rights which man is bound to respect." I take Asa Gray's point to be this. Darwin had shown that all life is related. We're kin to the apes. If this is true, then if we have rights, would it not follow that they have rights as well? It's a good question, and now I want to leave Darwin and talk about this as a philosopher, although, as I said before, given the experience of my students, I'm not sure I am a philosopher. Actually, this is a useful thing. If I have time, I want to append a little discussion to what I had planned to say on the subject why Ray Fry should be a vegetarian. The reason I wanted to do this is I find my disagreement with Ray to be one of the most frustrating kinds of disagreements you can have. I agreed with almost everything he said this morning. Not quite, leaving aside the usual little margin for nitpicking. I agreed with almost everything he said this morning. Everything about the value of life, the comparisons between the value of human life and non-human life. Yet he then concluded, He accepts these principles, but so he's not a vegetarian. Well, I accept those principles. I am a vegetarian. Now, one of us is really wrong. Actually, you have a sort of funny situation here. You have Tom Reagan, who has certain principles and is a vegetarian. You have Ray Fry, who has certain principles and is not a vegetarian. Then you have me, and I have Ray Fry's principles, but Tom Reagan's conclusion. If you want to conclude from all this that philosophers don't know what they're talking about, just remember that I've disclaimed my membership in this group. Now, here's the most important thing I can teach you. If I could teach you one thing, this would be it. People think that the most important question that has to be answered in this area is, where do you draw the line? If you've ever, well, I should say, if you've ever, all of you have been in discussions of this issue, and the question is always, well, where do you draw the line if we're talking about animal rights? If you don't draw the line between humans and other animals, do you draw it with the primates? Do you draw the line with fish? Do you draw, where do you draw the line? People always ask me this. The answer is, that's the wrong question. I mean, if you ask that question, there's something very important you haven't understood. So I want to, if I can, persuade you that I'm right about this. I want to teach you something which will stop you from asking that question, and which, when you hear somebody else ask this question, you'll just smile knowingly because you will have transcended that. Okay? All right. I believe that one of the most important principles which we all share is something I call the principle of equality. The principle of equality is what is really underlies Asa Gray's point in the paragraph that I read. It's a fundamental moral principle, first formulated by Aristotle, that like cases should be treated alike. If you're going to treat cases differently, there needs to be a difference between them that justifies a difference in treatment. Aristotle just put it this way: like cases should be treated alike and different cases differently. I take this to mean that individuals should be treated in the same way unless there's a relevant difference between them. If you want to treat one person one way and another person another way, you've got to be able to point to some difference between them that justifies treating them differently. Suppose you're on the admissions committee of a law school and you think you should admit this applicant but reject that one. Well, you need to be able to point to some difference between those two that justifies admitting one and rejecting the other. Otherwise, it's just arbitrary. Suppose you're a physician and you have two patients. One, you put her arm in a plaster cast. The other, you give a shot of penicillin. If this is correct, then you ought to be able to point to some difference between them that justifies putting one's arm in a plaster cast and giving the other a shot of penicillin, right? One has a broken arm, the other has an infection. Easy to do. So, differences in treatment have to be matched up with differences between the individuals that justify the differences in treatment. It's a fundamental principle. Now, here's a very important corollary to that. Very important corollary. Whether a difference between individuals is relevant to justifying a difference in treatment depends on the kind of treatment in question. Whether a difference between individuals is relevant to justifying a difference. I'm going to write this on the blackboard. I am a professor after all. You know, when you teach undergraduates, you learn that anything you want people to remember, you have to write it on the blackboard. And there's a corollary to that, too. Never write anything on the blackboard unless it's something that you want students to remember. Because anything that goes on the blackboard automatically goes in those notebooks. And if you mistakenly put up some trivial thing on the blackboard one day, you'll find every student trying to work it in on the test when time comes. What does this mean? Well, let me continue with the very simple example that I gave a moment ago. You're on the law school admissions committee. You accept one candidate, you reject another. You give a reason for that. One candidate had very high college grades, the other didn't. So that's your criterion. That's your basis for accepting one candidate, rejecting the other. You're a doctor. You put one patient's arm in a plaster cast, you give the other a shot of penicillin. What's the difference between them? Well, one had a broken arm, the other had an infection. Now, suppose you were the doctor and you put one patient's arm in a plaster cast and gave the other a shot of penicillin. You were asked to justify that, and you said, well, the first patient had very good college grades and the second didn't. Or suppose you were on the admissions committee and you accepted one applicant and rejected the other. And asked why, you said, well, the first applicant had a broken arm and the second had an infection. Simple example, but I think illustrates very clearly this idea. Whether a difference between individuals is relevant to justifying a difference in treatment depends on what kind of treatment you're talking about. Okay? A difference that's relevant in one context may be completely irrelevant in another context. Okay, now with that in mind, let's talk about the kinds of treatment that we've been discussing here. Causing pain is, of course, something that concerns us from a moral point of view, and whenever the ethics of experimentation is discussed, it's almost always pain that occupies center stage. If you ask that old question we talked about a moment ago, where do you draw the line? If this were asked in the context of admitting students or rejecting students for law school, the answer might be, well, you draw the line somewhere around B+. We'll let in the B+ students, but not just the B students. If you ask a doctor where you draw the line with respect to giving shots of antibiotics, a doctor might describe some way of distinguishing those patients who will be helped by antibiotics from those who won't. So you talk about drawing the line there. Well, if we're talking about where do you draw the line, and we have in mind the question of when is it right to subject a being to painful treatment, the line will be drawn between those animals who are capable of feeling pain and those who aren't. So the critical capacity that you ought to look at if you're worried about the ethics of causing pain is the capacity for suffering. Now suppose it's not the capacity for suffering that you're concerned with, though, but suppose it's not causing pain you're concerned, but killing. Killing is different. I mean, you can kill an animal, including a human animal, without making them suffer. So if you have a principle of not causing suffering, that doesn't imply anything about killing, since you can kill people without making them suffer if you do it right. Where do you draw the line when it comes to ethics of killing, if you're concerned about that? Well, I think here something like the notion of having a life, as Tom Reagan was talking about yesterday, might be very useful. We can distinguish between those kinds of creatures that have lives and those who don't. So perhaps it's the possession of a life in the biographical sense, not the biological sense, which is important here. What does this mean? Well, actually what you find if you look at non-human animals is something like this. Having a life depends on having a variety of psychological capacities. In order to have a life, you have to have a fairly extensive repertoire. You have to have the capacity for having plans, for having hopes, for having aspirations, for being disappointed. And of course, people can have those capacities to a greater or lesser degree. And if we look at non-human animals, we find that some animals don't have lives in the biographical sense. They're just too simple. I don't think that bugs or clams or snails or shrimp have lives in a biographical sense. Question about where do you draw the line amongst those animals when what you're concerned about is dividing creatures who have lives from those who don't. It's going to be hard to draw a line because you get a range of cases exhibiting all kinds of degrees of all kinds of psychological characteristics. Suppose what we're talking about is not causing pain or killing, but the deprivation of freedom. You take a creature and cage it up, cutting it off from its normal life. When we do this to human beings, it's called imprisonment, right? Deprivation of freedom is an evil. Well, what are the characteristics which are relevant to judging it to be right or wrong to deprive someone of their freedom? Here's where I think something like autonomy comes into play. In philosophy, you're constantly bumping into what I think of as big fuzzy ideas. Big fuzzy ideas sound very important, and they can even be very important sometimes. But they're very hard to deal with, and often I confess I don't understand them. And I used to think it was just my fault when I didn't understand these ideas, because other people were just cleverer than I am. But as I've gotten older, I've gotten more vain, and I no longer automatically think that when I don't understand something, it's my fault. So I think maybe it's really confused. Here's a big fuzzy idea which came up yesterday, the idea of respect. Tom Reagan said that the basic right that he was defending as owed to all creatures was a right to equal respect. Respect is a big fuzzy idea. What does it mean? I don't know. You tell me. I know what respect is. Respect is like if at the end of this lecture you applaud. Disrespect is if, like, when the lecture is over, you all say, "Oh, you're crazy, get out of here, you're no good, we're sorry we invited you," right? I know what it means to respect somebody or not to respect them. If somebody came in and said, "I respect Jimmy Carter, but I don't respect George Bush," I know what they're talking about. In fact, I respect lots of people and don't respect others. And if there's a right to equal respect, I suppose I violate it all the time, because there's a lot of people I don't respect. So I don't know what's going on with these big fuzzy ideas sometimes. Autonomy is sort of an idea like that. There are a number of capacities that I think are very important. The capacity to make choices, to have intentions, to care about one's future, to the capacity to value some things, to care about some things and not care about others. The capacity to make significant decisions where there are options open to you, and your own life, your own welfare, or the life or welfare of others that you care about are going to be affected by which choice you make, and you make this choice. I know what all of those things mean. Now, often when people talk about autonomy, though, they say things that I don't understand or don't understand so well. They say things like, well, to be autonomous is to have a self-concept and a sense of oneself as extended over time and into the future, and it requires that you be able to form judgments, and that you do form judgments about yourself, and you have attitudes which have as their object your other attitudes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, being a philosopher, I kind of like that stuff. I think it's all very interesting. But when I stop and think about it and take it seriously, it sounds like if that's what it means to be autonomous, probably the only people who are going to be autonomous are other philosophers, because they're the only ones who kind of think about these things in just the way that it's said that you should. So anyway, with that little aside, where do you draw the line between those animals that it's okay to cage up and those animals that it's not okay to cage up? Well, you want to look not just at the capacity for suffering, not just at the possession of a life, but at a capacity for making choices. It may very well be that there's no objection whatsoever for confining a shrimp within a small space and keeping it there forever. Maybe there's no interest whatever of this shrimp being harmed by that, because if maybe a shrimp is not the sort of creature that's capable of making choices in any sense in which could be described of as autonomous or agent-controlled behavior. But then there are other creatures that, monkeys most obviously, for which this would be true. There are other examples I've got on my list that I'm not going into because I'm running out of time. Other kinds of evils: mutilation, blindness, the loss of a limb, being caused mental distress, having psychopathology induced, as it's sometimes done for experimental purposes. In each case, if you ask, where do you draw the line between those beings whose interests generate legitimate moral concern and those whose don't, the line is going to be drawn in a different place, because it's different characteristics of the creatures that will be engaged by the different forms of treatment. This is what I meant when I said at the beginning that the question, where do you draw the line, is almost always the wrong question. Where do you draw the line with respect to what? With respect to what kind of treatment do you have in mind? And suppose you went into a doctor's office and said, "Doctor, where do you draw the line?" Well, out of context, you would have no idea what you were talking about. I mean, even in an animal rights discussion, or in a discussion of this topic, if you just ask, where do you draw the line, out of context, I would have no idea how to go about answering that question. Now, if you said, I anticipate an experimental setting in which animals are going to be treated in thus and such ways, now what are the moral concerns that I can legitimately worry about, and where am I going to draw the line with respect to animals that I should or shouldn't treat in these ways? Then if you've got specific forms of treatment, we talk about specific places in which lines might be drawn. Finally, very quickly, why Ray Fry should be a vegetarian. I agree with much that Ray said. Specifically, I agree that the lives of animals don't have the same value as the lives of humans. If you had a forced choice between causing the death of even a very intelligent animal, such as a rhesus monkey, and causing the death of a human, I think it would be better to choose to cause the death of the monkey. So I don't believe with Tom Reagan that there's anything like equal value of life there. I agree with Ray Fry that there are differences. Ray and I agree, however, that this doesn't entail that the lives of animals have no value. If the lives of animals have any value, then it follows that some justification is required for killing them. In the process of raising and slaughtering animals for food, they're killed. This requires some justification if you think that the lives of animals have any value at all. Now, what's the justification? The justification could be, well, it's very good reason for that. We have to kill them to eat, otherwise we'd starve to death. But no, we really wouldn't, since we could eat vegetarian meals. We don't have to have animals as food. So what's the justification? Well, I guess the justification is that we like the way they taste. Given a choice between a vegetarian meal and a meal including meat, we prefer the meat meal, not because it's more nutritious, but because we like the way it tastes. So if you think that lives of animals have any value at all, it would have to be such a slight value that it would be outweighed simply by your enjoyment of how they taste. That seems to me to be such a slight value as to be virtually non-existent at all. So I can't believe that if the lives of animals have any value at all, it's something that can be outweighed just by how they taste, by our enjoyment of how they taste. So I think that on those grounds, since Ray and I agree that the lives of animals have some value, even if not as much as the lives of humans, that he ought to be a vegetarian too. Why have I brought this up in a class devoted not to the question of vegetarianism, but to animal experimentation? I don't know, I thought it was kind of interesting. Thank you very much. Yes?
The why you brought it up, I assume, is to lead to that first question is, then does it follow that it is justified to use animals for research if the hoped for result of the research is worthwhile?
On the view that I've presented, the interests of animals count very importantly. When an animal closely resembles a human in the relevant respects, it's inconsistent to give weight to the interests of the human and refuse to give similar weight to the interests of the animal. So I think that the interests of animals count very significantly in calculating what we should do. Now, I can't conclude from that myself that experiments on animals are never justified. And hey, I don't believe that about humans. I believe that experiments using human subjects are sometimes justified. But what's required in each case is an assessment of the good that's to be done in the experiment, balancing that off against the harm that would be done to the animal in the course of the experiment. Now, you may say that's excessively abstract. I had a debate once with a psychologist on this issue, and he said that he agreed with me that the interests of animals did count for something. You shouldn't be needlessly cruel to animals. He also said that he agreed with me that frivolous experiments should not be done. But of course, where we disagreed was this. He did not think that any psychologist he had ever known had ever performed a frivolous experiment. Not one. If you take seriously the idea that the interests of animals count, then at least some of the time when you do the balancing, you're going to come to the conclusion that an experiment shouldn't be done. You know, at my university, there's an animal use committee. I guess it's pretty standard now at research universities. I guess you all know about this. And there was a real debate on that committee when it first formed about whether or not it would be right in principle ever to reject any proposal. And the philosopher on the committee insisted that if the interests of the animals have any weight at all, then that means that sometimes proposals are going to be rejected. Sometimes the animals are going to win if their interests are accorded any weight at all. I'm still waiting for the animals to win one, though.
I thought you set yourself up nicely to make a further response to Ray's talk. I just wanted to suggest something. Richness of life, it seems to me, can only possibly be relevant with killing and maybe deprivation of freedom, but not for causing pain.
Absolutely right.
Okay, because with causing pain, pain is pain, and it doesn't seem at all relevant that one life is richer than another, that the same amount of duration of pain would count more in the human case than, say, a rabbit's case. But it could in the case of merely taking life, because what you're taking away is presumably of different value. And similarly with the deprivation of freedom, because when you confine, you are preventing less rich living from taking place in the case of a normal human than in the case of a rabbit, but not for pain. And I think that was not made clear. I think Ray agrees with me on that, but
Yes.
it wasn't explicit.
I won't even comment on that, because if I commented on it, I would just be repeating what you said. I think that's exactly right.
I think you have to be careful here to differentiate between the two major components of pain. With respect to the physiological component, I would agree, but not with respect to the affective component, which is what I thought you meant when you put down capacity for suffering.
Okay, just to make sure we're talking about the same thing, what do you mean by the affective component?
It could be a stress that is caused by the pain or the anticipation of pain or by the memory of pain.
Oh, okay. Then we are talking about the same thing. I think that first of all, when we talk about animals, we have to be clear about which animals we're talking about, since what's true of one species may not be true of another. If we think about mammals generally, I think the evidence is that humans do have a significantly superior capacity for anticipating, remembering, and being distressed by pain. That's right, and that should be figured into any kind of moral calculation, because that is an important difference between us and them. But it's not that animals don't have any capacity for remembering or anticipating pain. An animal who's been in an adversive environment, which has been hurt before, will certainly, when he's placed in that environment again, will certainly show fear of what's about to happen, indicating a capacity for anticipating pain and being distressed by the anticipation. But you're right that those two have to be distinguished. Yes?
I'd argue that the capacity to anticipate or remember pain can be used to mitigate against the effect of pain. I mean, if I know that pain occurs in some sort of predictable way, I can prepare myself to reduce the suffering.
Yeah, I guess that's a skill that some people might have. How do you do that? No, I mean, it's not a joke. I mean, I'm just very interested.
Well, I mean, if I know that, for example, I'm going to have a boring lecture only once a day, I mean, I can prepare myself to maybe avoid that classroom. Or if I realize that I'm not going to get shocked except when the researcher does X to me, or then I can prepare myself and recognize there's a safe period. So it seems to me you could use those same capacities to perhaps argue that because animals have a decreased capacity to predict or to remember pain, that they cannot act in a way to reduce or mitigate the effects of pain because they don't know when it's coming.
That would argue for being, in a certain way, more solicitous of the animal suffering than of a human.
Right.
since a human has more built-in capacity for handling it than the animal. Could be. Yes?
You made a comment about your abstractions, which I'd like to congratulate you on. I guess my question is, can I take you back to work with me next week?
I have my price.
The important thing to me here is that you stay in abstractions when you're not dealing with specific characteristics. And then again, you just mentioned specific characteristics that make one group of animals different from another, and their needs and considerations different. And I think that's vital, and I got into it with the young man this morning, because that was glossed over. I can deal with algebraic abstractions if we stay in algebra. But I think the three of you have done that very nicely. And I like to deal with Tom Reagan too, because every time I pin him down on a fact, he automatically comes back like he did yesterday and apologizes for being a demagogue when he's on the steps of NIH. And I think he'll quote me on that too a few years ago.
Right.
But that is a vital fact. That enables us as quantitative type people to be able to understand you all as abstractionists, if I may use the term. But I can use what you have to say and to give to me when I go back to the committee and deliberation.
Thank you. Let me just reinforce one thing that was said about this business of drawing lines. See? Who should be admitted to this university? Well, one criterion would be people who can read. Can't read, can't get in. That's a good criteria. That's a good way to draw a line. Suppose I say, well, I'm going to be concerned with animals who have lives, or animals who are capable of autonomy, or something like that. And then the question really is a question of whether or not you should be willing to do an experiment which causes a certain amount of pain. And you reassure yourself, well, I don't think this animal is autonomous. It's kind of like saying, I'm going to reject this student's application to law school because he had an infection. Or I'm going to put this student's arm in a plaster cast because he had a B average. You know, you've got to be careful to line up the relevant criteria with the type of treatment that is at hand. And if the type of treatment that is at issue is causing pain, autonomy is irrelevant.
I'm not precisely sure where my question was here, but I was intrigued that you started off with Darwin, and you listed Darwin's line of continuity with humans and animals.
Right.
One thing that he missed was the fact that he recognized that we are related to animals, whereas they don't recognize that reciprocal relationship.
Quite right.
And that seems to be a very unique distinction. And I'm wondering if you see that there's anything grounded for morality and grounded for ethical decision making in that distinction between human and animal.
That's a very interesting question. Would the fact that we are capable of appreciating our place in the evolutionary order, whereas an ape is not capable of that, could that be a relevant difference that could justify treating a person in one way that you wouldn't treat an ape, or vice versa? Well, I think it probably would be relevant to things like university admissions. So that if any individual, ape or human, did not have the mental capacities for understanding things like that, they have no business being a student in a university, because they don't have the capacity for acquiring university education if they can't understand things like that. So there's an example of a type of treatment to which that difference between humans and apes might be relevant. But notice that the kind of treatment that I've mentioned is a kind of treatment for which that particular difference is obviously relevant. Now, what I don't understand is how some philosophers refer to differences like that as the basis for some great grand division between humans and apes that would justify not only not admitting them to universities, but keeping them in zoos, training them to perform in circuses, and all the rest. I can understand how inability to comprehend theories of natural history might be relevant to justifying keeping somebody out of a classroom. I can't understand how that inability justifies training them to perform in a circus if that's contrary to their interests. It's another example of what I thought about where the line gets drawn depending on what the kind of treatment that you have. Yes. I don't know how long this can go on. Maybe I should have one more question or one more? Okay. Thank you for being patient.
I must admit, during this conference, I've come to learn that as a scientist, I have a certain capacity for moral philosophy, and I'm not sure that it's as high as I thought it might have been, but I found your talk extremely appealing in many respects because it causes me to want to apply the correct measurement tool to the correct question at hand. But I also find it almost overwhelming because it seems like there are too many possibilities now of measurement tools and ways in which to make the evaluation for the questions that exist within the realm that we work. Okay? And every time I start to think about a specific example, I start to realize too that there are probably just as many people who are going to argue from one end of the scale as are going to argue from the other. I mean, a good example is how many pigs' lives, we talked a bit about this last night, is it okay to take in order to provide an insulin shot for a diabetic? You know, I mean, I get to these very specific, very concrete examples, and I feel like I'm going to explode because I don't know how to answer them. And that's just one example, and then there's, hundreds of others.
Unfortunately, I think that the scheme I've given you, although it's complicated, just reflects reality. I think we would all like simple procedures that would give satisfying answers. However, I think moral reality is complex and messy. You do have to take a lot of things into account and balance a lot of things off against other things in order to make a responsible judgment. Also, there may be some questions that simply don't have answers, like how many pigs' lives can you sacrifice in order to provide insulin for one diabetic? Pardon?
But how do you verify your opinion?
Well, I was about to tell you because saying there's not an answer was a prelude to saying that. I think that, as I said before, and it's Ray Fry, neither Ray nor I are absolutists in the way that Tom Reagan is. Although we come to very different conclusions about how we should behave, philosophically we're not absolutists. I think that human life, or saving the life of a human, is more important than preserving the life of a pig. I don't think that's, the moral arithmetic could justify wiping out the entire species of pigs to save one human life. I wouldn't think that was right, although emotionally I feel somewhat drawn to that. When I stop and think about it, I don't think that's a justifiable thing. So how many pigs can you sacrifice to save a human? It's kind of like the question of how many hairs does it take to make a beard? One hair isn't a beard, two hairs isn't a beard, but if you keep adding them one at a time, pretty soon you'll have enough to make a beard. I think the number of pigs that you're justified in sacrificing to kill a human is kind of like that. After a while, you've got too many, but I don't know where the line comes. I mean, if I had the question, how about 3 pigs to save a human life? Fine, I got no problem with that.
But if there's no answer to the question, how do we operate in our daily lives? Or how do we operate as members of animal care communities?
You make judgments, and you try to make those judgments as reasonable as you can. Now, even though there may not be a definite answer, there can be more and less reasonable answers. And this comes up when you deal in borderline cases. Unfortunately, there are such things as borderline cases. Borderline cases occur when there are two courses of conduct, and there are some pretty good reasons in favor of each one. And the reasons in favor of course A are not obviously better than the reasons in favor of course B. I know on a committee you would like to have some easy way to deal with those kinds of cases, but I don't think there are any easy
It
ways.
doesn't have to be easy, I just need
No.
to be able to do it, day in and day out.
But isn't
Yeah.
the whole thrust of the kind of argument you've been making, at least initially, is that there's some way to quantitate or some way to value on a consistent or non-subjective way these values? And part of the frustration that I'm hearing, and I think it's a typical criticism of utilitarianism, that ultimately it depends on who's doing the valuing. That's the ultimately determines more than anything else which side of these issues come down. The example you used of your friend on the ACUC, who says, of course, they have some value, but as you say, well, we've never gotten to the point where they really have, you have seen that. The real issue is who's doing the valuing, who's making the determination. And that's ultimately the problem with the utilitarian argument, is that there is no neutral or socially acceptable objective value of utility. To be able to make those moral judgments that you're talking about, you need a moral structure that's more Aristotelian, where you have a discussion of virtues of judgment, where that is explained in a more adequate way. You can't just invoke that at the end of a utilitarian argument.
Well, I can certainly invoke at the end of a utilitarian argument that there's some cases that are very close calls where reasonable people can disagree and you have to make a judgment call. There's nothing inconsistent with utilitarianism in that.
Well, but you haven't, there's no, my point is a more methodological one. It is that there is nothing in a utilitarian argument in and of itself that helps us understand how we make those judgments well. And what you deal with is, I don't know if that's me or you. I'm starting to beep, I don't know if that's But there's nothing in a utilitarian argument that talks about the personal values of virtue of good judgment. And what we see is people struggling to say, well, we've got these objective values. We've got to value the utility of suffering or pain over here. And what we see is an extraordinary spectrum of people weighing these values differently. And it's the historical problem of utilitarianism that it's finally people in power who make the values that count, the people in institutions that make those values that count. Part of the animal rights movement is to try and say, if we can make these arguments strongly enough and with enough heartfelt emotion, maybe we can get people to start weighing these values differently. It becomes a matter of rhetorical devices rather than a matter of objective argument. And that, I think, is part of the frustration that people are expressing in the argument. It's certainly my frustration.
Well, that's a very eloquent plea for a different kind of theory. Maybe your watch has gone off because it's past time for us to stop, so I'll let you have the last word. Thank you.